Welcome to episode 124 of the Headspace and Timing podcast. Today, I'm having a conversation with Navy SEAL Eric Gleeson about his book, Taking Point, a Navy SEAL's 10 Fail-Safe Principles for Leading Through Change. Eric and I have a great conversation, not just about his book, but about his transition out of the military and how he and the organizations he's involved with are addressing the mental health, wellness, and suicide epidemic in the special operations community.
The statistics are sad and very unfortunate. We've lost a couple brothers to that here in the recent years. But I think that one of the things that we're seeing that's really positive within the ranks of active service, and I've experienced this through work with the SEAL Family Foundation. I know that we're, at least within the special operations community, trying to invest more time and resources into proactively working with our active service members on mental health, TBI. We're investing more heavily in just general psychological wellness and trying to change the narrative and change the culture within the community so that it's okay, and people can be open about proactively treating mental health challenges that they face, as opposed to the whole silent warrior, well, we don't talk about that type of thing. Well, we have to talk about it.
Welcome to the Headspace and Timing podcast, a show dedicated to breaking down the stereotypes around veteran mental health. My name is Dwayne France, and I'm a retired Army non-commissioned officer and a combat veteran of both Iraq and Afghanistan. After retiring from the Army, I took on a new mission as a clinical mental health counselor for my fellow service members. If you served in any branch of the military, then you're familiar with the M2 machine gun, the 50 cal. It's one of the most effective weapons in the military's arsenal. If the weapon's headspace and timing wasn't set correctly, however, it was just a useless chunk of metal. Veterans can be rendered inoperable if their headspace and timing's not set correctly either. That's my goal with this show, to change the way that we think and talk about veteran mental health and reduce the stigma against seeking support. Each week, we'll talk with mental health professionals, veterans, and those who support service members, veterans, and their families. We're going to have real and honest conversations about a topic that most just don't like to talk about, veteran mental health. Let's jump into this week's conversation. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Headspace and Timing podcast. Welcome once again to a show that's really trying to change the way that we think and talk about veteran mental health. We have a lot of different guests on the show, many of which are mental health professionals or veterans with their own mental health journey and mental health story. But as you've often heard me say on the show, that this isn't just about being crazy or being broken or being sick. It's not about mental illness. It's about mental wellness. And my guest today is Brent Gleeson. He is a Navy SEAL combat veteran. He's an entrepreneur. He's a best-selling author, and really embodies a lot of the concepts of mental strength, mental wellness, and resilience. So Brent, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks. Happy to be here.
Yeah, thanks for taking the time. I definitely want to talk about all of the things that you're doing to really sort of make an impact in your post-military career. But before we get into that, I'd like to give you an opportunity to tell the audience a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Just a quick background. Grew up in Dallas, Texas. Did my undergrad at Southern Methodist University. And actually worked for a year in finance prior to joining the Navy. It's kind of a funny story. One of my fraternity brothers in college kind of talked me into the idea, not overnight, but it was a longer conversation. But he and I, after I worked for a year, he graduated. He was a year behind me, so he and I joined the Navy together to try out for the program and. Joined Buzz Class 235, graduated, went to SEAL Team 5. I joined right before 9/11. So at that point, 9/11 had occurred. Afghanistan had kicked off, and then Iraq spun up. And our task unit from SEAL Team 5 was the first task unit of SEALs deployed into Iraq in early 2003. Did a couple tours there, tour in Africa, some other places, and then kind of stuck to my plan, got out, went to graduate school, and have since become, an entrepreneur, an author, a speaker, and currently run a consulting firm. We focus predominantly on organizational design, culture transformation, and leadership development.
That's definitely trying to wrap up 10 or 12 years in a 30-second pitch. But often, especially when I talk to those who had joined the military right before 9/11, that 9/11 was a shift for them, right? You think you're joining the peacetime army and then, or the peacetime military, and then you don't. But you knew what you were getting into. It's not like the Navy SEALs or the Special Forces or anything like that. We're just sitting back on their heels when it wasn't when we weren't at war. But things shifted for you pretty early in your military career to focus on real world action rather than just sort of the preparation for stuff.
Right. Yeah. It was, and I actually write a little bit about that in the book as far as the correlations we can draw between the military's sort of structural and cultural transformation after 9/11, how we can relay that to sort of the world of modern business. But yeah, it was a major cultural shift in mindset, and constantly bringing lessons back from the battlefield, applying that to how we train, how we invest in resources, even our talent acquisition programs, how we fill the top of the funnel with candidates that are most likely to successfully navigate the rigors of special operations selection. But it's been an interesting journey.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I was actually in on some of that. And I was in Germany on 9/11 and wanted to go to Fort Campbell because I knew exactly what was going to happen. And the Army, in its infinite wisdom, decided to make me one of those talent acquisition specialists for the first 3 years. And so I was a recruiter, recruiting at the beginning of the conflicts. And then your career is limited as it was, but it was definitely packed with a bunch of different things. And especially, I'm seeing a lot of individuals, in that 2003 to about 2011 or 12, that you're not making this a career because you serve a career's worth of service in a truncated period of time. I saw a lot of, mid-level officers, mid-level NCOs deciding to, I've done what I came to do and I'm going to continue to move on. What was it for you? And you said you had the plan going in, but what was it for you that decided not to take it farther and remain in the Navy?
Well, it's something I look back and reflect on often, actually. And I've talked to other, colleagues and friends of mine, whether they be Army Delta, SEALs, Green Berets, just talking about that feeling of regret, when you get out, whether you did 6 years, 8 years, or 15 years, you always feel to some degree like you're leaving your brothers and sisters on the battlefield. But back then, at the time, I had a plan. Like you said, it was a rigorous, a rigorous time, more rigorous than we all anticipated back then. But looking back, if I had a crystal ball, I probably wouldn't have gotten out when I did. We all just assumed that these conflicts couldn't possibly go on for as long as they have. And here we are. So, it's, doing several combat tours to some sounds like a lot. As these days, if you're doing a career, that's not a lot. I've got buddies who've done 13 combat tours. Obviously, it's a different life. It's very, very difficult, as on marriage, family, raising kids, and just your physical and mental well-being. But yeah, looking back, I probably would have stayed in longer. Easy to say that now, but if any of us had any idea how long these conflicts would have gone on, probably would have changed the mindset as far as what a career in service looks like.
That's an interesting perspective. You think the merry-go-round is about to slow down, so I'm going to jump off. And then once you jump off, you realize that it's going to be spinning around for a little bit longer. I'm interested to hear how that was for you, that transition, right? Leaving the military, leaving the Navy, especially leaving such a significantly tight brotherhood as a special operations community, and going out into, now you're no longer, you were in finance, you're no longer an accountant, you're no longer a non-military, you're this weird third thing called a veteran. And that culture that you mentioned that is now, you're trying to apply that to post-military life. How was that for you?
It was okay. I had a very specific plan as far as what that transition would look like. Part of that plan was to have very little downtime between getting out and then what next project would be. So I actually applied to grad school prior to my last deployment. So I was accepted into an MBA program before I did my last deployment. and literally started that program 2 weeks after I got out of the Navy. So it was what I saw or what had seen in the past is, especially in the special operations community, those coming out with a good plan, whether that be, another career path, graduate school, whatever that is, usually thrive in that type of environment, especially if it's a very rapid and smooth transition. Those who give themselves less of a plan, have more downtime, kind of not sure what they want to do, you see a little bit different path. Sometimes there's some confusion. Sometimes that downtime, from what I've seen, allows for the voices to creep in and start questioning what that transition looks like. I've got a good handful of buddies who transitioned back into the Navy 6 months to a year after getting out, because they didn't have that sense of camaraderie, that brotherhood. They felt a little bit displaced because, especially those who stay in longer, you get sort of institutionalized into that environment in a good way. I mean, and then you feel less of an identity when you transition out because that's all you've known for so long, and you're a high performer in that arena. And sometimes that doesn't always translate to high performance until you find a way to channel it. But it doesn't immediately always translate into high performance in the civilian world.
I really appreciate that. The idea of needing to have a plan. And I'm thinking back on, again, both my transition when I retired, and I was in for 22 years, and I retired in 14. Essentially, I look back on it, and I was starting to plan probably 6 or 7 years as I started down my degree path. Did a lot of that when I was in the military. And then contrast with that with other things that I've seen. There's a story that I experienced. I was going to hang out and drink coffee with a first sergeant buddy of mine, and we walked into her orderly room, and there was one of her E6s sitting there, and she looked at him and was like, "Get out of here," right? And I was like, "What's up with that?" And she says, he retires on Friday. His last day in the Army is on Friday, and he won't leave. He still comes in for, PT in the morning, and he comes in at work, and she says, I've taken all his work away from him. And she was like, he is not ready to make the change. And she was, and she was truly, frustrated and really shaking her head about the fact that, we need to make this mindset shift. And it sounds like with the plan that you did that you said, I know that there's going to be this end date to my military career, and I need to plan for the next step. But those that you say without a plan, it's almost as if the end of the time in the military sneaks up on them.
Yeah, and a lot of my close friends who are still in are doing just that. Like you said, they've been planning, 5 years out prior to their retirement or their the date that they have in mind for their exit and their transition. A lot of them already going back to school or getting advanced degrees or starting to do a lot of networking. One of the great things that we've seen now, as you know, is this cropping up of really great nonprofit organizations like the Honor Foundation, Elite Meet, other great organizations that are really helping. Now, some of these organizations, as you know, specialize in the upper tiers of special operations, fighter pilots, things like that, helping them transition. That's their niche, and those programs work really well. It's just really great to see our veterans coming out, and one of the ways they continue to serve is by serving their fellow veterans, and in large part through Honor Foundation, through Elite Meet, and some other similar organizations. That's one of their ways to serve, is to help other veterans have a positive transition, help them with everything from resume writing to interviewing skills to actually networking with executives from organizations that have really solid veteran programs, and helping veterans transition into a career path within their organization. So that's one thing that I've seen. It's just really awesome to see that there's actually formal programs now that are helping veterans transition.
And especially, as you said, those highest performing individuals, because it wouldn't be there if it wasn't necessary. I had Jacob Toops from Emerging Vets and Players on the show, and yes, especially our highest level operators in the military, and those professional athletes that are playing in the professional stage. Once you leave, there is a severe gap in your life, right, that you need to figure out how to fill, because at one moment you're operating at the highest level on the highest stage and doing it well and loving it. And then 6 months later, barely anybody might know who you are or what you did. And that's a struggle for, and again, as I'd mentioned, I have had, I know many Green Berets and have had a couple on the show, that it's really a whirlwind. You didn't necessarily experience that because you had got your mindset shift connected to, I'm going to make this change, and prepared ahead of time.
Yeah, and it's funny. I actually spoke at an event for an organization I mentioned previously called Elite Meet, started by a former SEAL, and they specialize in helping special operators and fighter pilots transition into the workforce. And I, volunteered my time and spoke at one of their events in San Francisco, like a lot of us, have. And I was talking a lot about, advice that I have as far as transition and selecting a career path or, going back to school or whatever that is. And to be totally candid, I was nervous to speak to the group. And I'm a professional speaker. I wasn't nervous because of speaking. I was nervous because the majority of the people in that audience, had served longer than I did. And so I was nervous. I was like, are they going to respect what I have to say? And, all that, all those things. And, you when you have such deep respect for a community like that, you care what they think, and you care if you're going to add value to them. And because that's what you're there to do. And it was just such an amazing experience because they were sponges. They were listening to, they were hanging on every word. I had so many great questions. And it was a good experience, and also helped me realize that regardless of the tenure of service and what you've done in the military, transition can be daunting. It can be scary, and there's a lot of ambiguity and uncertainty. Not like on the battlefield, but a different type of battlefield. So it's good to give back in that regard and understand those challenges, because what I've seen is also the longer that our servicemen and women are in the military, sometimes the more difficult that transition is.
That's entirely accurate. The idea of, you go to be a senior non-commissioned officer, a senior officer leading, or even, our mid-grades, you have a 26-year-old E6 that is in charge of, dozens of lives and millions of dollars of equipment in Afghanistan. Now, all of a sudden, you come back and, here's the mop, sweep out the latrine, right? And this is going from something that was extremely meaningful and purposeful. And again, coming back, and not knowing what it looks like. And I think that, as you said, are they going to value what I have to say? I would imagine if you were talking to a group of, newly graduated SEALs that had never, or perhaps hadn't deployed in a special operations capacity. Well, you had already been there and done that, right? You had executed the mission of transition and they hadn't. And sometimes it's hard when you're inside the machine to conceive of life outside the machine. And you had successfully made that transition and come back and were able to, again, as you said, give back and give some of this understanding of what we need to do to prepare psychologically, mentally, and resilience wise to be able to make this transition.
Well, it's a great story to tell too when we're talking to our young folks who have an interest in military service. So on the front end of all of that, it's great to have veterans out there telling their story of transition, because there's so many positive opportunities and things, as that come from military service in any arena that can benefit a person throughout their entire personal and professional career afterwards. So that's one of the things that I do is I do mentor guys going in through the SEAL program and whatnot, but also just having spoken to other groups and meeting the young people or the kids of business colleagues and things like that who have an interest in service, and there is a really positive story to tell as far as what military service can mean for the rest of your life. So preparing people sort of mentally and emotionally for not just going into the military, but having that longer term vision of what that service can mean. Also, I think helps prepare them later on for that transition as well. So they kind of go into it understanding what a later on transition might look like.
And I think that's very important as well. This idea of, if we continue this narrative of the broken veteran, right, or the wounded, wounded warrior, and I'm not downplaying, of course, that these things do exist, but if the young people of this nation constantly think that, the inevitable outcome of military service is post-traumatic stress disorder and alcoholism, then we need to change the way that we talk about military service and, sure, the psychological impact, and be able to bring out those positive things, because if not, that's a national security issue, and we're not going to continue to have the young men and women coming in that we necessarily will need to continue to support and serve.
Well, and you're totally right, and there's so many, and we see this on social media now. There are people out there who are changing that narrative, a narrative about resilience and bouncing back from adversity. I'm currently working on my second book, and it's about personal transformation. And there's I've obviously, as do you, have colleagues who've experienced extreme adversity on the battlefield, and now they're out there telling their story of resilience. I've got a buddy, Jason Redmond. He was shot multiple times in the face, neck, and arm. Doctors told him he would probably never walk again. He would definitely never work out again. He's had a lot of facial reconstruction on his body, but he's out there telling the story. He works out, he runs long distance, and he's back. And that he actually hung a sign. You can look it up, a sign on his door at the Naval Hospital at Bethesda that garnered the attention of the then President George W. Bush. But basically, he got so sick and tired of people coming in and crying over him and saying, "I'm so sorry, how'd this happen to you?" And the sign basically said, "Don't cry for me. I got these injuries doing a job I love, doing it for brothers I love, doing it for a country I deeply love. This is a story of resilience. So if you're here for anything else, don't enter." It's a really powerful message. And there's so many other veterans out there that are telling their stories of resilience. I've got, endless stories of that, like you do. But that's the narrative that really needs to be preached, because yes, sometimes we will experience adversity on the battlefield, but there's a lot of stories like this and research that shows that a little bit of adversity sometimes makes us more mature and have a better outlook on life.
Right. You're absolutely right. This idea of, post-traumatic growth, right, is through adversity, we become stronger. I mean, and this isn't a new idea, right? Nietzsche, whatever doesn't kill me makes me stronger. Right. And we've seen this through history, right? Would Grant had been an effective general if he hadn't been a failed businessman, if he hadn't learned how to fail, if he hadn't, labored in obscurity in the West before he was brought out East. And so there's this idea of, just because you get punched in the face it doesn't mean you're weak. It doesn't mean you're not capable. And if you get knocked to the mat, sometimes that can sort of, that can definitely set you up for later success, because somebody who's never experienced adversity won't know how to lead and follow, in some senses, in the face of adversity.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously I've seen that, not just from my own experience, but with, a lot of very close friends and colleagues. And, again, it's just it's good to continue to tell these stories, so that, to your point earlier, that we don't continue this narrative of the broken veteran. And
See, and you'd mentioned a couple times your book, Taking Point, and this is what you're trying to do, is take your experiences in the Navy and your leadership concepts and apply that to the business community. One of the things, after I got my clinical mental health degree, I still had some GI Bill left, and I went back and I got an MBA, and I was talking to the dean in getting ready for the interview to get into the program, and she told me, "Oh, you're going to learn so much about leadership in this program," because she said, and I just kind of nodded and smiled. She said that leadership in business is so much different than leadership in the military. And I said, okay, well, thank you for letting me into your program. And of course I knew that as through in much of my experience as an enlisted leader in the Army, was perfectly applicable, and I was able to help my fellow classmates on different concepts. And it seems like that's what you've done with Taking Point and really with your columns in Forbes and Inc. I'd like to hear a little bit about the development of the book and sort of what your aim was.
Yeah, no, that's actually a really funny story that you're going to learn so much about leadership in your MBA program. But a lot of the trials and tribulations of leadership experienced on the actual battlefield and then translated over to the figurative battlefield of business and entrepreneurship. Some things translate well. Some things are more challenging, especially when managing multi-generational workforce. Younger generations in the workforce today, people who are motivated by different things, inspired by different things. It's complex in a much different way. One of my biggest challenges was utilizing many of the sort of leadership skills taken from the SEAL teams, but also having to adjust much of that style to the civilian workforce. And a lot of that I did through things like 360 reviews and getting feedback from the team. One of the things that I've seen is, the best leaders out there are humble and they're lifelong learners. And they crave transparent feedback from those they lead. That's one of I found that self-assessment is probably one of the least effective tools to understand how good you're doing at leading your team in whatever environment that is. But over the years, it's not just necessarily a passion for the specific companies that I've started, but a passion for building high performance teams and aligning culture with strategy and the desired results of the organization, understanding how behavioral norms and cultural elements play into the financial performance of an organization. That's kind of what sparked the interest in writing the book and the timing of in which I did that. And it came out a couple of years ago, a little bit over a year ago. Was really about it's very culture driven. So there's 10 principles, and it's all about leading organizational change, drawing on a lot of the lessons learned that we've seen in the military's almost constant state of transformation over the past 18 years. And what can we learn from that as far as applying that to the world of VUCA environments in modern business?
Yeah, and looking through a lot of these steps, if someone looking from the outside said, I ought to learn how to lead like a Navy SEAL, and that's not the goal of the book, but this idea of somebody picking it up and, okay, trust, accountability, preparation, but for a lot of time, people, inclusion, and they don't realize, especially those who have never served, how actually inclusive the military is. My first roommate in the Army was a Hawaiian kid, and so there was no way, other than being in the military, that a suburban kid from St. Louis is going to meet a kid that grew up in Hilo. And so when there's this, it seems like that there's some counterintuitive things, and this is as much trying to help people understand that a lot of the things that people are looking for in the business world come from, and lessons from the military can be applied to what they're looking for.
Yeah, no, it's an excellent point. I get those questions a lot, and maybe it's during Q&A after a keynote speech or something, but the level of diversity and inclusion in the military is oftentimes overlooked, especially too in the special operations community. You have people from all walks of life, from trust fund silver spoon kids to people who came from nothing to guys who've never seen the ocean before. It's a fascinating experience, as in all branches of the military and all levels of service, how diverse things are. And one of the things I touch on in the book is not just the importance of diversity, but the importance of inclusion as it relates to engagement and participation in any organization, especially an organization that has a desire for high performance, has a desire to positively lead change and transform and grow and be creative and develop great products and services. But when you have low levels of engagement, and there's recent Gallup research that comes out every year, it's gotten a little bit better, but on average, usually around 20 to 30% of an organization are engaged. The rest are either disengaged and not participating to the highest capacity, and another percentage, usually around 20%, are actively disengaged, meaning they're actually working against the organization. So that's one of the critical importance and priorities of leadership and management in the modern world, is making culture and employee engagement part of the strategy, not just an afterthought, but actually part of the strategy, and understanding what implications that have on productivity, efficiency, growth, profitability, retention, et cetera.
I really appreciate you bring that point out, this free rider problem, right? They're the ones that are really kind of just going along and not paying the toll. Definitely there is some of that in the military, right? They're shamtastic. I mean, in some in different times, and definitely not in others, but it's nowhere near that level of, only 30%, a larger number of individuals in the military, whatever, a small unit team all the way up to large organizations, it's greater than 30%. And so I really appreciate how you take these lessons that you learned and then have the ability to translate them into, and this is a challenge that I think a lot of veterans have, is they don't know how to translate their military experience, and not through an MOS translator, but just the concepts. And you look like you grabbed the concepts here and are able to translate that in ways that the business community can understand, and learn how to value potential veteran employees more.
Well, yeah, and obviously full transparency, the quote unquote wisdom that is gained and reflected in the book is just predominantly a long list of failures that I've gradually learned from over the years, and figuring out what works and what doesn't, and sort of being in a constant state of after action review, and applying those to what does work in organizations, and obviously doing a lot of research, and then having had the opportunity to consult with other organizations. And the interesting thing you see is the challenges we face in business, as you know, regardless of the size of the organization. Sometimes, obviously, size adds a different level of complexity, but regardless of size, regardless of industry, the organizations, or the challenges we face are all very similar and heavily related to people challenges, and behavioral challenges, and cultural challenges. I've been in organizations like Vistage and been close to the YPO community, where you have basically sort of your peers, leaders of other organizations, and we all face the same things. So drawing from lessons learned from the military or from other colleagues in other organizations is a great way to better understand your own organization and your own success or failures as a leader within that organization.
Right. And then this idea of, obviously failures, and we've all had, especially in post-military, we're trying to figure things out. But you're not just communicating to the business community from your military side. You're also turning back around and supporting those service members, SEALs. You said that you're on the board of the SEAL Family Foundation, that you're taking the lessons and quite possibly probably the failures that you've experienced in post-military life, and translating that back to those that are coming behind you to be able to smooth their way a little bit more as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. One of the things that we see a lot is, especially from high performers in a military environment, we see this with tier 1 operators, and I share this when I'm talking to some of these audiences. We get out, and because you have that high performance mindset, oftentimes we kind of shoot ourselves in the foot because we want to do everything and we want to do it well. So then you end up doing a lot of things poorly, and just trying to go full steam, all in all the time at every opportunity you see. And guys just run themselves ragged, as opposed to being a little bit more focused. Sort of a slow is smooth is fast mentality. We kind of forget that when we transition out, and we want to do everything. We want to do it well. But we sometimes lack that need for focus and that need for a plan, as opposed to just doing 7 different projects all at once, and not really succeeding at any of them, or at least not in the way we desire to.
Right. And there's this idea of trying to fill the space after the military, right? You know, when you leave the military, there's this huge hole in your life. But even as you mentioned it before, the extremely high operational tempo of our most elite forces, right? You know, as you said, 13, 14 different deployments. And perhaps they are, 7, 8, 9 month deployments, versus, some of the 12 or 15 month, but still they're significant. And that rotation has a significant toll both on the service members, and on the families, as you said. And I'm curious to see how, and you'd mentioned before, we started to talk about how it can grind people down, and it does have a psychological impact, and both the operational tempo, but also the suicide epidemic in the special operations community is pretty significant.
Yeah, it is. It's the statistics are sad and very unfortunate. We've lost a couple brothers to that here in the recent years, but I think that one of the things that we're seeing that's really positive within the ranks of active service, and I've experienced this through work with the SEAL Family Foundation. I know that we're, at least within the special operations community and NSW, trying to invest more time and resources into proactively working with our active service members on mental health, TBI, just general health and wellness, so that we can combat these issues not after they get out or 10 years after they get out, because research shows that sometimes PTSD symptoms can rear its ugly head 10 years after your transition out of the military, or 10 years after your last sort of traumatic experience in the military service. So I can speak really only for the Naval Special Warfare community, but we're sending our active duty operators to, for brain treatment, for treating TBI. We're investing more heavily in just general psychological wellness, and trying to change the narrative and change the culture within the community so that it's okay, and people can be open about proactively treating mental health challenges that they face, as opposed to the whole silent warrior, well, we don't talk about that type of thing. Well, we have to talk about it because we have active duty operators who have TBI, who have PTSD. And it's not something that, again, as you know, it's sort of like, oh, well, we treat veterans for that. Well, no, we need to treat our active service members for that now, as opposed to 10 years from now.
I really appreciate that. And that's, I think, one of the unfortunate long-term side effects is we're still contained in the same conflict, certainly, and we're able to take the lessons learned from the beginning of the conflicts and apply them to now. But even as you said, and yes, late onset PTSD is very real. There were studies that showed in the mid-90s that Holocaust survivors who showed no PTSD symptoms started to develop them in their 70s and 80s. And we're starting to see Vietnam veterans who had been, nominally or even explicitly as successful are now experiencing these things as they're starting to retire. And there's a number of things, that show about that. But this idea of it's great that we're taking care of those current active service members, but we're 5 years beyond, 10 years after the most traumatic things. So those operators that served in your time, the early years and those that got out in maybe 06, 07, that was just in the beginning of when we're doing this, and really trying to figure out how do we reach back and support those service members that are struggling, 15 years after their experiences in the military.
Yeah, those are interesting statistics too. I actually learned that from a VA counselor that I met with years back, around the time I was transitioning out, and she told me some interesting facts about what you said. She's like, I'm now seeing Vietnam veterans on a regular basis that are just now starting to really experience PTSD symptoms. And another interesting thing she said is, as it relates to sort of changing the culture and mindset of proactively getting, therapy and things like that, was that you can give your spouse or your significant other PTSD just by unleashing all of your stuff on them, and because they love you, they want to carry that burden with you, and therefore sometimes they end up carrying that burden with you. So it's it's one of those elements that causes us to really encourage our active duty members to get ahead of it, because it's the responsible thing to do.
There definitely is that concept of vicarious trauma of even, and especially even for providers, those maybe who didn't serve but are supporting them. And to be able to combat against that, I understand that's really what the SEAL Family Foundation is trying to do, is not just to, the spouses, but also, there is intergenerational trauma that can exist. And even to the point of, my son was born 1 month before 9/11. He turned 17 this past August. He turns 18 this August, and he could enlist and serve in the military and serve in the same battlefields that I served on, right? And so there's this idea of a cross-generational conflict, but also intergenerational trauma. I'm interested to hear how the SEAL Family Foundation is really trying to support readiness through taking care of the family.
Our biggest mission is what we refer to as family resilience. So obviously that's not just serving the operator. It's also obviously serving the entire family. That's why we're the SEAL Family Foundation, because for example, one thing we're trying to do is reduce the divorce rate. And therefore, one of our missions is healthy marriages. So really integrating the spouses into the community more, providing more resources for them, more resources for the children, keeping families together, providing resources for everything from various types of programs that we fund to scholarships for college. So family resilience is our number one mission. And when the family is healthy, the operator is more healthy on the battlefield as well. And that also impacts, retention rate and things like that. So, we're constantly not just, obviously we have the downside of the job is that we support the families of our fallen operators and whatnot. But, one of our biggest initiatives is supporting the families of our active service men and women in the NSW community to create that level of resilience and family readiness and healthy marriages, healthy relationships between, the operator and their children, because it's not just the right thing to do, but it improves retention, it improves general wellness, and it improves the ability to transition later on.
Yeah, and really it does take care of, some of these risk factors that are included whenever things do go south. As you said, these disruptive transitions or these concerns, it's been shown that if you have a more stable, a more supportive family life, then the traumatic experiences are less likely going to impact you. And I appreciate the focus on divorce. I had a buddy of mine who once told me he's a Green Beret, and he said that Green Berets have 3 wives: the one that you went to selection with, the one you deployed with, and the one you retire with. and those that don't, and a good buddy of mine has been married to his wife from before they joined in his time in Special Forces. He said, but I'm an anomaly, and just that constant turmoil, that constant turnover, that lack of a stabilizing force can lead to challenges. And it's really great to hear that the SEAL Family Foundation is trying to address that particular risk factor and keep it from getting it to a crisis point in the first place. Yeah,
exactly. We want to get ahead of it before it's unmanageable for the families. And that's our primary mission.
Now, this has been really great. I really appreciate, again, the idea of you could have went back and put your head down and built your companies and just sort of driven forward, but both taking what you learned in the Navy as a Navy SEAL and taking what you've learned as an entrepreneur and giving it back to the operators and service members now. I think it's an amazing mission. It seems like you're doing an amazing job, Brent. So I'm wondering, what kind of stuff do you have coming up? What kind of things are coming up for you in the future? You mentioned a second book.
Yeah. We're just, this is my third company, just really expanding our services, products, and the team in general. Got 3 kids, so that keeps us busy. And working on the second book. It's working title is Embrace the Suck. So a title that I think you can resonate with. But it's really about personal transformation. It's sort of falling into that sort of newer popular genre of counterintuitive, in-your-face self-improvement narrative, as opposed to sort of the early days of the more popular, think positive all the time and, and all that. It's a little different storyline than your typical self-improvement book, which I think is obviously pulling from not just my stories and experiences, but some of our colleagues from the military and other interesting stories about overcoming adversity, because there's a lot of great stories out there like that. So those are just some of the few things coming up.
Yeah, that's great. The idea of embracing the suck is definitely necessary, and many of us do that in many different ways. But the idea of resisting the suck is the problem of, when things kind of go off the rails, right? When you try to, when you're not as resilient as you possibly could be, that's when things can get challenging. So if people wanted to find out more about you, what you're doing, you're Taking Point Leadership, all of that, how can they find you online, social media, that kind of stuff?
Sure. I'm on LinkedIn, of course. I'm newer to Instagram, but I am on Instagram, Brent_Gleeson. My speaking website is BrentGleesonSpeaker.com. Our company website is takingpointleadership.com. So there's just some of the few ways that you can learn more about me and our organization.
That's great. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today, Brent.
Absolutely. It was an honor. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. You're listening to Headspace and Timing, where we're trying to change the way that we think and talk about veteran mental health. I've heard it often from the special operations community. They recognize that they hold a specific status in their respective military branches and are looked at as the elite forces. Many of them are starting to say, like Eric does in this episode, that the responsibility for leadership does not end when they leave the military. They need to take the lead on being vocal about taking care of themselves psychologically after leaving the service. There have been a lot of discussions about perpetuating the broken veteran stereotype and how we should address the psychological impact of military service by showing the good as well as the bad. Some have argued that we should only show the good to counteract the bad. Only talking about one side of the conversation, though, is not giving the whole picture. We have to acknowledge that the military benefited us in a lot of ways, but also messed us up in some others. Like when we were in the military, and like Eric talks about in the show, we have to figure out how to maximize our strengths, use the beneficial things we learned in the military and our post-military life, as much as we have to minimize or eliminate the deficits. None of us are getting out of the military without a couple of dents in the fender, but that doesn't mean the car isn't drivable. It just means that we've been around the block a few times. Thanks for listening to the show. If you want to find the show notes for this episode, go to veteranmentalhealth.com/HST124. If you want to show your support for the work that we're doing, make sure to leave an honest rating or review on the podcast player of your choice. We're always looking for guests, either veterans or those who support them. You can drop me a line at info@veteranmentalhealth.com to recommend guests, or you can go to veteranmentalhealth.com/guest to fill out a suggestion or request. I'm happy to announce that I've released a paperback version of the first Headspace and Timing book. It's been available on Kindle for a couple of years, but now you can get it along with Combat Vet Don't Mean Crazy. To check it out, go to veteranmentalhealth.com/HST book. Just a reminder that the guests and information on this show are for educational purposes only and not meant to be considered professional advice. While I am a practicing therapist, I'm not your therapist. If something you've heard makes you think that you should talk to somebody, then reach out to do so. I'd like to thank Doc Todd for giving us permission to use his track Not Alone from his album Combat Medicine. Doc's trying to bring the discussion about veteran mental health out of the darkness, and you can see all of his work at therealdoctodd.com. Make sure to join us for the next episode. Hit subscribe on your podcast player of choice so you don't miss it. Until then, remember, veterans, you're not alone. Ever.
The struggle is real, found a feast and lost a soul. Eventually my drinking, it got out of control. There in darkness I roam, struggling to find home. See, suddenly death didn't feel so alone. 22 a day, destination unknown. It could have been avoided if you picked up the phone, but now you're gone, so I guess all we get is the tone. Nothing but bone, weeds overgrown, pushing up stones. I've triumphed over mind in tranquility. Authentic tendency, embrace my ability.
Oh, I try so hard to have faith. I bow my head and I pray. Lord, please let me the strength to carry on and keep
Stand up.
How this life so demanding, so much pain unexplaining. I heard each time my way,
Tell 'em, man.
but with you I'm not alone.
Not alone. You're not alone.
Ah, yeah. That every time that I fall, I'ma call on you, get myself back up again.
Without my Georgia girls, yeah, I'd probably be dead. Cause I'd be taking every med that the VA said. Gave every shred, every last thread of my identity. Conquer my fragility, eliminate the enemy. Deliver me, God, from temptation. Tell me that this life is just a matrix. Need a facelift, back to basics. Vision LASIX, I only feel alive when I hear the bass kick.
Oh, I try so hard to have faith. I bow my head and I pray. Lord, please let me the strength to carry on and keep standing.
Stand up.
How this life so demanding, so much pain unexplaining. I heard each time my way, but with you I'm not alone.
Not alone. Yeah. You're not alone.
Ah, yeah. And every time that I fall, I'ma call on you, pick myself back up again.
Yeah, just pick up the phone, you're not alone. Just pick up the phone, you're not alone, man. Just pick up the phone, you're not alone. Yeah, pick up the phone, I'm right here. And I love you guys. Take those bottles out, dog, and pour them in the sink. Take the needles out your arm and the gun away from your forehead. It's time, man, you've been through enough pain, stand up. It's time to stand back up. All my veterans, man, Army, Marine Corps, Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard. Get up, you know.
Oh, I try so hard to have faith. I bow my head and I